because it turns out that there were unelected people before whose name you don't know that had access to the very same information that that the Democrats are criticizing someone like Musk having.
Yeah, I would definitely say I'm voting for the platform. I think the real politics is in Congress and also state politics for sure.
Well, I guess I'll just give my perspective on this.
Okay.
I think you're underselling sort of the power of the bureaucracy and the fact that it basically stays the same throughout even changing administrations of changing political parties. Those people are.
Rob Noerr forces this progressive Jolah into revealing that he thinks the deep state is actually a good thing. Yes, that's right. The deep state is a good thing according to this progressive Jolah. And Rob Noerr has to set him straight. Let's see how this debate between Rob Noerr and progressive Jolah goes down.
Who votes on getting rid of that? You're going to be surprised that there's some agreement that we have on this, actually, right? So the first thing is the idea of Congress. That was the first thing you said. I sort of agree. I think that Congress has abdicated its fiscal responsibility in huge ways under both Republican and Democratic presidents. And it's outrageous. Like, Congress is supposed to control the power of the purse. The truth is, the biggest problem, in my opinion, with our country is that you could just give me a quick answer. What do you think the strongest branch of government is?
I think it definitely should be Congress.
But what would you say it is? I agree with you.
Yeah, there's a huge issue with executive power, and this goes through it like every president.
Yeah, but I would say specifically, I agree with you, but I would say specifically it's the bureaucratic state. Like, I think the previous administration showed us, like, Joe Biden wasn't running the show. Like, the problem is presidents come and go, but this unelected bureaucratic state that's really in charge of making the on-the-ground decisions, they're the ones that are sort of unaccountable, and they're making the decisions that remarkably affect us, whether that be Obama, whether it be if McCain would have won, whether it be George Bush, etc. That's where the real things are getting done. So, for example, even when it comes to funding, the truth is, I think you would agree with me, like, the way we do funding in Congress is a joke. We wait until, like, it's almost the 0 hour, and then we pass these continuing resolutions or these omnibus bills that are thousands of pages that are riddled with pork that almost no congressperson that's voting on it's read the entire thing. And even if they did, they haven't had time to understand. Like, I think we both agree that's a big problem, right?
I think we need to also, so I'm not against the bureaucracy in a sense of, well, if you view it as like we have one executive that's a president, they have like their cabinet and they should control the show, then that definitely can be your perspective there. But I think that's more directly unitary executive and more authoritarian than it would be, because the bureaucracy is a buffer made by agencies that Congress is putting into law. It's a buffer that, like, when you vote for a president, you're voting for the entire administrative state. I did not vote for Joe Biden. I did not vote for Kamala Harris. I did not vote for Obama. I voted for who they're going to have working for them. Same with Trump. They hand him executive order. She's like, what is this one? I have hot dogs. Oh,
so you find it
hot dogs. It's like he doesn't know what the things are that he's signing either.
Okay.
Yeah, no, not true. I voted for Donald Trump mostly. When I voted for Donald Trump, I voted for him first. And then I voted everyone who he wanted in his cabinet like second. That was like my secondary concern.
Democratic criticism of like, oh, it's not really Trump, it's people like Mux, that you think that's an absurd criticism because it turns out that there were unelected people before whose name you don't know that had access to the very same information that that the Democrats are criticizing someone like Musk having.
Yeah, I would definitely say I'm voting for the platform. I think the real politics is in Congress and also state politics for sure.
Well, I guess I'll just give my perspective on this.
Okay.
I think you're underselling sort of the power of the bureaucracy and the fact that it basically stays the same throughout even changing administrations of changing political parties. Those people are, it's not a good thing. It's a very bad thing. They're unaccountable. So
the deep state is a good thing, according to Jolah. Is his name Progressive Jolah or just Jolah? On the title, it says Progressive Jolah, but I don't know if that's just for just keyword sake, or is that his actual name, Progressive Jolah? Either way, Jolah saying the deep state is a good thing is wild. Mr. Bernie Sanders over here, that's a good thing. Breadlines, they're a good thing. Deep state, they're a good thing.
Let's look at just, for example, the power of the purse specifically. If you're someone that's concerned that Congress should be the most powerful branch and you think that they've been abdicated to executive authority, think of how this goes. Congress signs this funding bill that's thousands of pages that almost none of them have read, and it gives this money, but the devil's in the details of how the money's spent. So, for example, like something like USAID, they might sign something that's like $5 billion to cancer research. But the way that's being implied is being done through these bureaucratic agents that aren't elected, that are basically staying there through one presidential term to the next. They basically stayed there from W. Bush to Obama, from Obama to Trump largely, from Trump to Biden, and they'll be there from Biden to Trump. And that's why we see these decisions that end up benefiting sort of people that aren't the middle class, that aren't the working class, because the real power in Washington isn't changing. It's always the status quo. And so I don't disagree with you that I think a better policy would be, we have too much, whether it be with tariffs or whether it be with sort of attacks, declaring war, etc. Congress was supposed to be the ones that are more on point in that, but they've abdicated their responsibility. And it's not even the president, it's people behind the president, most of which never changed, that are an unelected bureaucracy. This should scare the shit out of everyone, right? Like, for example, when Chuck Schumer said that the president of the United States in 2016 couldn't criticize the FBI because if they did, they'd find 6 ways of Sunday of getting back at them. Donald Trump is the leader of the FBI. He is the leader of that agency. And here is his direct opposition, the most powerful Democrat at that point, Chuck Schumer, saying, we can't criticize the FBI. They're unelected and they'll screw us over. They'll find 6 ways of Sunday. Like that, it doesn't get more unelected than that, right? And those people are here to stay. So I do agree with you that the problem isn't just with Trump, it's that historically, and we can see when it comes to these issues of tariffs specifically, I forget what president it was, where they signed this legislation that basically gave tariff responsibility to the president. So it seems entirely legal. But I think you're right. I would prefer that we have actually members of Congress that are doing their job and actually doing things when it comes to the power of the purse and doing things when it comes to international trade. I think for an emergency level, I don't have a problem with president having temporary emergency powers over things like tariffs, etc. But that, I'll give you a chance to respond. That's what I feel. I'm directionally in agreement with you that I would rather Congress be doing this stuff, but they're not going to because they're worthless.
So like Congress is the entire issue. The gridlock in Congress, the fact it's dominated by their stock trading and their inability to focus on good policy, that's the issue with the executive, in my opinion. Because if they wanted to change the culture of these different agencies, they could pass more clear laws. So they run more effectively. They could, make different standards on when to hire and fire people, which can help the president, if there is an issue, go through a legal process to fire someone, to identify the problems, which there are some legal processes for removing people that Trump kind of bypassed a few times. That's a different conversation. My overall thing is why I think it's a good thing why you have career bureaucrats is because you want people from, like, I'm happy there's people from Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush again, Obama, Trump, Biden, and Trump, because that is an anti-corruption mechanism within itself. That's why I don't like the unitary executive theory, because their goal is to fire all the other people that could be a balance on their power, instead of having to be like I want the government to be made up of, Republicans and Democrats, even in the executive. But if we don't have a bureaucracy that is set by Congress, that Congress actually maintains, and that's the big issue for me, is the lack of Congress, because we basically don't have a Congress anymore. It's complete BS. But that's my issue, because I like that. I think it's an anti-corruption mechanism. But after you answer this, I want you to
anti-corruption to who?
It's anti-corruption for the executive branch. So it's not like there's only Democrats interpreting the law or only Republicans. You have a mixture of both. But once you respond to this, I just want to know what would you do to? Are there any reforms that you would pass to fix Congress?
Sure. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. But it's anti-corruption to people who would threaten the status quo. But those that have the power, like, for example, if you look at the first impeachment of Trump, over and over, you had people from the State Department saying Trump was going against our foreign policy. But Trump's the leader of the State Department. He sets the foreign policy as the duly elected leader. So the problem is the bureaucrats that came from Obama, that came from W. Bush, that came from Clinton, those bureaucrats in that chain of it were saying, it's our policy, we set the policy, and we expect the president to go along. And this goes back to what Chuck Schumer was saying. If you get someone in there that says, no, I don't like that. I don't like the fact that the real power lies with the bureaucracy, and so we're going to challenge that, then they'll come after you. And you could say, well, that's an anti-corruption mechanism, because that ensures that if you get a Republican president that's corrupt, the bureaucratic state could go after them. If you get a Democratic president that's corrupt, but what happens if the bureaucratic state's corrupt? And the status quo, you say that you like that, well, then you're advocating for a status quo, and you could understand why people want radical change, because that status quo certainly has won and been good for the people at the top of this country, but it has been abysmal for the people in the middle of this country. And they're waking up to that fact. They were lied to about the promises of the people that run these mechanisms, about NAFTA, about China entering the World Trade Organization. And they've been repeatedly told how great the economy is doing because we point to things like the stock market, we point to things like GDP. All the while, we are entering unsustainable levels of debt, and there's no accountability because these people aren't elected anyways. You don't even know most of their names that are running these bureaucratic...
One big point then.
Rob Noerr is completely correct in there. That's the issue with this whole deep state thing is that, but what if they're corrupt themselves? And what if you get a president in there that's maybe trying to do the good thing, trying to do good by the people, and the bureaucrats don't want him in there or doing these things? That's the biggest problem with the deep state. In order for this anti-corruption mechanism to work, you have to make sure that they aren't corrupt themselves.
There's one big point about this though. Like, so there's executive power. And that executive power is delegated through all these agencies that Congress made. Now, if you get rid of the agencies, my concern is you're not getting rid of executive power. So the president then, with the unitary executive theory they're looking to achieve, has all that executive power siphoned to only him, essentially, because all the cabinet members are yes people. They're going to say yes to whatever Trump says. So my thing is the big bureaucracy makes it harder for the executive for one person, like the president, to control the entire executive branch as a unitary executive. And that's my big thing right now. If like, I might be able to agree with you in some areas if Congress took back tons of power from the executive, but I think that's completely not going to happen ever. But the executive would still have way too much power, even if you fire people from it. The government's even big or smallness is a power thing, not a people thing.
I don't disagree, but the problem is if I accept everything that you just said, and there's a lot that I agree with there, right? I still think that the bureaucracy is the real problem, but certainly it comes through the executive having more power because the bureaucracy is there as part of the executive than Congress, and Congress has abdicated their power, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem is, at least in my world, when you're saying unitary executive, blah, blah, like all that stuff, like at least there's accountability in the fact that we can get rid of it in 4 years. How do we get rid of the bureaucratic state? Who votes on getting rid of that? If Congress is unwilling to do the job and the president is neutered by them because they're really running the show and they'll go after presidents that challenge them, as Chuck Schumer's even admitted, then what's the mechanism for ending that?
You would need to prove they're not following laws by Congress, because all they can do is follow the laws and execute them. So you have to find like which laws of Congress are passed that the executive is not following. Because if the bureaucracy is not following the laws, they're not following the law in general. That can be challenged. But like the Congress needs to pass better laws. I think you're blaming the executive and bureaucracy for the fault of Congress.
Well, but still, if we've both admitted that Congress won't do it. So at least the world I'm talking about has accountability in that we could point to, that's the guy that made the decision, Trump and the cabinet guy that he appointed. We reject them. It might take 4 years, but we will vote them out of office and their people, and we'll put in their opposition. The way it works today, we can't do that. We're both admitting that Congress isn't doing anything to change it, and Congress should do more. So in that world, why would we prefer a bureaucratic state that members of Congress are admitting we're afraid of? Because if we go after them, they have the power. And the idea that it's like, well, what can they legally do? Well, it's not a matter of legality. Legally, Congress has abdicated this responsibility and allows, for example, on things like funding, allows these organizations to have this sort of monolithic control on how this money is put into effect. And so,
well,
from
I
my
hate Chuck Schumer, so
okay, but from my perspective, like, look at it from someone like me. Like, hell, let's take me out of it. I'm not a big pro-life, pro-choice, but I am pro-life. But it's not something I talk about a lot. I think people are more articulate on that position than me. But like, why, for example, should my tax dollars go to USAID to fund abortions in another country? Why should that occur? But I have no say over that. If Congress would vote on it, then yeah, I could have some say by voting, but Congress is going to abdicate the responsibility. And instead we say, well, that's just HIV funding. And so it falls under that umbrella, and those mechanisms can do what they want. How would you feel if we took all of that money that went for HIV funding and funded pro-life, pro-Christian programs in Africa? Wouldn't that infuriate you?
Well, they're kind of doing that now. Like, my issue, like, they're using my money to take political prisoners. So, like, you know what I mean? So that's already an example.
Well, no. So it's different than you disagree with sort of immigration policies that are being acted by the president versus the funding question. The funding question is, we fund sort of causes that Congress has said, here's a cause worth funding. Stopping fire damage in Somalia. But the way that funding gets put into almost always is anti-populist, pro-democrat, pro-progressive sort of mentalities. For example, we fund PBS through this that's clearly progressive, hates populism, hates conservatism. This happens over and over again. So from that perspective, if we're both offering competing visions and we're both saying the solution would be Congress actually being responsible, but both of us are in agreement that ain't happening anytime soon, and that hasn't happened. So in solution one, you have your solution of the status quo, which we could see the harms of the status quo, of not only how it's hollowed out the middle class in this country, not only how like our Congress is afraid of them and our presidents are afraid of them, but that it funds things that are directionally oppositional to me and there's no accountability to it. Versus the second, which is, okay, you might not like the president, and they, if they had more control, might fund things that's directly oppositional to you, but at least there's accountability in the fact we'd know who's doing it, and we could remove them from office.
It's just hard, like when Trump is going through and just like firing FBI agents that worked on January 6th, and he's just like denying basic rule of law, or like when the attorney general is just like dismissing Mayor Adams' corruption cases and a bunch of other crazy things. I want there to be a layer of protection from if a corrupt president comes into office who wants to violate laws and break laws. You want people in charge who are, people in the bureaucracy that are not going to break laws. Because if the president can bring in new bureaucrats every time, he could just bring in yes people to bypass all laws, and that's basically what they're doing right now. But like, it still is, the issue still is with Congress. And you said before, you're probably against every government agency. I'm in favor of agencies doing things, and we need agencies and bureaucrats to carry out the laws if we have laws. But you're against like funding education.
Sure.
So you get rid of the Department of Education. So like something like that, yes. I'd be pro something like that. But I'd say, okay, instead of eliminating it, let's write laws to make it better. And if they don't follow the laws, then we can talk about restaffing them. But I never want it to be just like, I don't like these people, so we got to replace them.
Well, I think that a big problem is that the federal government is way too big and is involved in way more things than it should. The Department of Education would fall into that. I think since the creation of the Department of Education, which if I'm not mistaken, wasn't created by an act of Congress, but was created by an executive order. I think since the creation of that, we've seen education in our country decline rapidly, even though we've increased funding for education to the point where it's a joke in many of the areas where you'd want it to be most successful, such as in the inner city. And as you know, in rural communities, education oftentimes a joke, public schooling in there. But that's a conversation for another day. I don't mind having it. But I certainly think that there should be some executive agencies. Like we should have an executive agency for law enforcement, like the equivalent of what the FBI does. We should have executive agencies for the State Department, et cetera. Of course, those sorts of things should exist. The problem I have is like, you're like, well, I want them there to ensure that a president's not being corrupt. But what happens if they're corrupt? Like, for example, what do you say to the whistleblowers that came out from the IRS and the FBI that said, for example, Ziegler and Shapley, that were saying, look, we were doing our job like we would with anyone else, looking into financial crimes of the Bidens, and basically the FBI told us, no, you can't do that. How do we stop that corruption?
I can't verify that story. Do you have another example that I might know about?
Well, like, there are stories replete with the fact that our FBI is targeting as aggressively as possible people like Trump that Chuck Schumer told us that they would because he criticized the FBI, and then defending the people that they said privately were saying, and even sometimes publicly, that they wanted to win, like Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden.
So these like liberals are freaking wacko. Like, they'll defend anything if it's against Trump. And what I got out of this conversation is that Jolah is pretty much defending the deep state because, well, Orange Man bad. He sees the deep state as some safeguard for Trump's corruption, pretty much. Like, oh, good thing we got that deep state there, or else Donald Trump would just be running amok and putting in all his yes men, as Jolah says, which we have now. These people, like, this is what I'm talking about. Like, this is like with the Trump derangement, because you have people defending wild things because Orange Man bad. You have people defending criminals getting deported from this country. Well, because Orange Man bad. We got to keep those criminals here. We got to keep non-citizens here because Orange Man bad. We got to keep the deep state around. Deep state, it's a good thing because Orange Man bad. Now, obviously, the deep state, the problem and the major issue is we don't elect these people. We don't even know who the deep state is, really. And we can't hold them accountable. If we don't like them, we can't vote them out. Rob Noerr made a great point, saying at least with Donald Trump, we only got 4 years, and then he's out. Any other president with their 2 terms, it's 8 years of them at most, and then they're out. But these deep staters, who knows? They could be in there forever and ever. I'm pretty sure Jolah, if the deep state were made of MAGA people, right? Fulfilling everything that MAGA wants, I'm pretty sure Jolah would sing a different tune about his deep state praise. But what did you guys think about it? Do you think my assessment's correct, or do you have a different take on this? Leave a comment in the comment section below. Give this video a like if you liked it. And if you really liked it, if you like seeing Rob Noerr do his thing in these debates, then I got more content for you on the screen, as well as my channel, plus much more content like this that I think you'll enjoy.